This is going to be the first lecture of Unit 1. We're going to cover information that's in the prologue. We should also be answering essential questions 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. Please remember that you should be copying down these notes as if we were doing them in class together, and the bolded information is going to be the most important information for reading quizzes and your unit test. So we're going to begin by talking about psychology's roots, its early story, the history of psychology. Psychology did not become psychology until about the 1960s, 1970s, but the idea of psychology has been around a lot longer than that. Psychology has its roots in philosophy. Before psychology became a science, philosophers sat around and debated questions like, do we have a soul? Is the mind and the body connected, or are they two distinct entities? Are the ideas that we have inborn? Are we born with all of the experiences that we will ever have? Or is the mind a blank slate that is filled by a learning process, by experiences? So philosophers like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they were really the first psychologists that we know of. And while a lot of them thought different things, they do give way to this new psychology that we will be studying throughout the semester. It wasn't until this philosophical idea became a science that psychology is born. And this first kind of idea of psychology is known as empiricism. This is the idea that the knowledge that we have is coming from experience via the senses. So we learn things through experiences. We watch things, we hear things, we taste things, we touch things. And in that process, we are learning, rather than these ideas being inborn, that we're born with all of the experiences that we have. The other idea behind empiricism is that science flourishes through observation and experiment. So the only way that we can truly know if we learn as we grow is through experimentation, is through data collection. And we do that in psychology via the scientific method. The scientific method helps to allow us to prove our hypothesis true or untrue. And so as psychologists, we collect data. We like to generate a theory that would help explain our data. We produce a testable hypothesis, and in our data collection, we have a results section. And the results section tells us whether or not our theory or our testable hypothesis is true or not true. You're going to be reading a lot more about the scientific method of psychology in Chapter 1. So the first person to take psychology from being a philosophy to a science was Wilhelm Wundt. He opened the first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in Germany, and he set out to, quote, measure the atoms of the mind. What he did in his lab is he had people press a telegraph key every time they heard a ball hit the floor. Now there were two different types of groups in his lab. He had one individual hit the ball or hit the telegraph key as soon as they heard the sound. So as soon as they heard the ball hit the ground, hit the telegraph key. They then took that same person and said, all right, we want you to hit the telegraph key as soon as you are consciously aware that you've heard the ball. And really what Wundt is studying here is selective attention. Of course, it's going to take us longer to hit the telegraph key when we're consciously thinking, okay, we've heard the ball hit the floor, rather than this knee-jerk reaction of just hitting the telegraph key as soon as we hear the ball. So he's using this scientific method. He's taking psychology from a philosophy, and by using measurement and experimentation, he is creating this psychology realm of what we know today to be a science. A lot of students think that psychology is a science because we study the brain. That is not true. We are scientists as psychologists because we use the scientific method. So building on what Wundt has done, Bradford Titchener, who was Wundt's student, sets up his own lab, and he decides that he wants to study the elements of the mind through this process of introspection. And this is what we know today to be structuralism. Through introspection, which is looking inward, exploring your own structure of your mind, he asked people in his lab to think of any type of images, sensations, affections, just reporting their experiences through introspection when they looked at a rose. So what type of images does it convey to you? And what Titchener is really studying is conscious experiences. So report looking at a rose, what are your immediate images and feelings? And you can assume that most people in his lab had different responses to this rose. Just like if I ask you to describe what this is, through this introspection, while we would all say it's a teddy bear and that it's brown, we would all have different responses because introspection, looking in, is going to be different for all of us. Same thing with this. While it again is a teddy bear, we're all going to describe it in different ways. Same thing with this. Now the only downfall of Titchener's structuralism is that it's unreliable. Of course, the results are going to vary person by person. And in all honesty, we don't know why we do what we do, or we don't know why we describe these bears or that rose the way that we do. So William James comes along after Titchener, and he rejects structuralism. He says it's too unreliable. He was influenced by Charles Darwin, who we know is credited with natural selection and survival of the fittest. And William James creates this theory of functionalism. Functionalism is this idea that we need to study our behavior and mental processes that allow us to adapt and survive and flourish in an environment. So he really focuses on what Darwin had done, and he says instead of looking at how the mind is structured like Titchener did, he says we need to look at how the mind functions. It is very important that you know the difference between structuralism and functionalism. Now, we're going to move very quickly into the different perspectives of psychology. And while this is not going to make a whole lot of sense to you right now because we're on the front end of psychology, by the time we get to the end of the course, you should be able to know these different perspectives immediately. I will say on the AP exam, this is one of the most tested kind of sections from the prologue. So please make sure that you know it. And again, like I said, it will make more sense as we go throughout the semester. Do make sure that you know these for your test on this unit. Now, psychology, once it took off from Wundt and Titchener and James, Sigmund Freud is really one of the psychologists where if you ask someone on the street, what's one psychologist's name, they're going to say Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is credited with this psychodynamic psychology. This is the idea that who we are as adults is made up of who we were as children. Sigmund Freud really focused a lot on emotional responses, on childhood experiences that affect our behavior as humans. And his theories became popular in the late 1800s. The only problem with his psychodynamic psychology view or perspective is that it's really hard to prove scientifically. So he doesn't use the scientific method necessarily. He just has these theories and things that he conjures up. We'll talk a lot more about him. He's a very interesting psychologist. The behavioral view of psychology, or behaviorism, really focuses on only observable behavior. So not what the mind is made of, but only on what we can observe in individuals. You've got John B. Watson, who did studies on little Albert, who was a 1-year-old child, and he's testing little Albert's responses with loud noises. We'll talk a lot more about him. B.F. Skinner was also a behavioral psychologist. He viewed the mind as a black box that can be taught basically anything as the child grows into adults. And he was really focused on how consequences shape behavior. So the behavioral view of psychology emphasizes only observable behaviors, not what happened in our childhood, not what's happening in our unconscious, only what we can see. You then had the cognitive revolution in psychology come about after behavioral psychology. Gestalt psychology is one of the hardest to understand for students. This perspective in psychology says that we should study things as a whole, and we should study patterns. We shouldn't just study one behavior that a person has done. We should study the person as a whole. And the therapy that comes along with Gestalt psychology focuses on treating the entire person, not just their physical ailment. Humanistic psychology, these individuals believe that we should focus on the realization of our full potential, that we should focus on the growth that people have, and that we should focus on our self-esteem, our belonging, and something called self-actualization, which is really being the best person that we can be. We'll talk a lot more about humanistic psychology as we go on too. Evolutionary psychology focuses on genes, genetic behaviors, how it has helped us to adapt and survive in our surroundings. They're really big on nature versus nurture, and of course natural selection through Darwin and people like William James. The best way to treat a person or to approach psychology is through the biopsychosocial viewpoint. This focuses on our biology, our brain chemistry, what's happening with neurotransmitters, focusing on our psychological state, and our social, cultural influences. So this is really taking all of the things within the person, what's happening in their brain, what's happening in their surroundings, what's happening in their psyche, their mind, and explaining their behavior through that. Now we're going to take this man really quickly and do some practice because you're going to be doing this in class.